Welcome to the webinar on positioning your value. This is really about the two different types of value that there are when we think about value. So we think about value often in terms of financial value, and you certainly have financial value in terms of your employability, but you also have personal values, things that are at the core, that make up the core of who you are. So we want to make sure that when we're talking about value, that we talk about both your personal value and your personal values. So we're going to look at identifying your values related to employment, the skills you gained, articulating those skills, using a tool called a word cloud to visualize those, and then how to help you to tie it to the labor market. Whether you've been in the world of work a long time or you're just starting into the world of work, what you'll realize is that you have some core values that go along with what you think work should be. So in the 1950s and 1960s, people thought that the exchange you had with around work and values was you work hard and you get a pension, or you work hard and you get a reward. And that reward was almost always financial. It wasn't about time, it wasn't about balance. But nowadays, we have expectations and values around work that there be a work-life balance, that the employer be family friendly, perhaps that there be intangible rewards, or that there be availability of things that help with your physical health. So some people are really concerned about gyms. I was talking to a couple of women and I was trying to help them find a different position, and they said, oh, but it has to be on this side of our base because this side of our base has the gym and we go to the gym every day at lunch. And I was really surprised that that would be, they weren't happy with their work. It was making them feel sick, but what got them through was this gym. And so they weren't willing to give up the gym to go somewhere new. So thinking through what it is that you want, what it is that you need in a workplace will help you when you're trying to apply to positions to know, does that workplace fall in line with my values around work? Once you've thought through what your work values are, it's really important to know what your personal values are, because your work values and your personal values can be in conflict. I had a friend who I was doing some career coaching with, and he did this activity on values. And what he found was that although he valued the work that he was doing and he wanted to do more of it and he wanted to do it in a more creative way, he wanted to be more free to do it, money was actually very important to him because he had a young family, two young kids, and he realized that he couldn't give up the money for the work that he wanted to do. It just wasn't going to be possible. And it really hurt him because he thought for sure his personal values would trump all the work values. And it turned out that at that time in his life, that wasn't going to be the case. So thinking through what your personal values are and recognizing which is most important to you right now, because values change. Your core values don't change, but the order of importance will change. So when you're young and you don't have a family, work-life balance might not be an issue for you. But when you have a young child or you've adopted a child, you may find that all of a sudden work-life balance is very important to you. So recognize that there's going to be a fluidity to this, but that recognizing at the start what your values are as you go into a job search will help you find the right company, the right career, the right job. Oftentimes when I work with people, they are really great at giving me a list of things that they don't want to do. For some reason, people telling you what they don't want to do seems a lot easier than people telling you what they do want to do. So I think it's important when you're starting out, especially when you're young and you've got all these opportunities in front of you, is to think about what aren't I willing to do? So are there particular industries like perhaps oil and gas, perhaps logging or forestry, perhaps you might have an aversion to working for a certain political party, perhaps you might have an aversion to working in certain regions. So what sort of things aren't you willing to do? For me, I could never ever work for a tobacco company. Just flat out couldn't do it. Wouldn't matter how much money they offered me because my core values are not aligned with the values of that organization. So when that happens, you end up with a values conflict. And my friend who works in learning, Joyce, tells a really good story about how McDonald's, which has a university, which seems staggering, but it actually does, and it is an accredited university. And they hired into their leadership development program a young woman who had all the skills and abilities. Her resume was fantastic. They were really really excited about this candidate, and they started putting her through the leadership development program. And they were finding she really wasn't doing well. And this was counterintuitive on paper. She looked fantastic, but the longer they sort of went through their program, the less she was being successful. And so finally, someone approached her and said, "Is it, this doesn't seem to be going very well. Is there something that we don't know? Is there something going on at home? Like, how can we possibly help you to be more successful?" And she finally admitted that she was a vegetarian and that she really had ethical concerns and ethical challenges about working for an organization whose primary goal was basically to sell processed meat and factory produced mass produced meat. So the company and she parted ways because it was a really bad fit. Her values were in conflict with her employer on a daily basis. So that's kind of an extreme example, but even for myself, when I started working for national defense, I was really worried about my values, um, about how Canada would be in the world. And I'm very much somebody who believes in peace and peacefulness. And so, how could I possibly work for a department that was maybe in conflict with those values? But luckily, I was able to find a place where um, I feel like I provide a service that helps people who are in the military to understand all the different aspects of themselves to make them a better soldier, which in my mind means that when they go out into this world, I feel more confident than I might have that we're sending people out who are truly are peacekeepers and not warriors. So recognizing those value conflicts is important because there will come times in your career, and hopefully not early on in your career, where you have to make decisions about whether money is more important to you or potentially some of the opportunities that are presented with job offers are more important to you than your core values. And if you can identify your core values early, it will really help you in terms of getting some clarity around where you want to work and then also around what you don't want to do work in. And I'll put some resources up for you so that you can do a values activity that should really help you in terms of getting a little bit clearer about your personal values and your work values. So next we're going to talk about some of the skills that you picked up when you were working internationally, whether you were doing e-volunteering or whether you were actually in country. It really shouldn't matter. These are going to be skills that are common throughout both types of work when you're working with CUSO International. And the reason you need to understand what skills you've gained is because when you're marketing yourself using your resume and using LinkedIn, you want to be able to show and to demonstrate that you have these skills, and these are often skills that employers are looking for, and we're going to look at that in a little bit. So let's sort of dig into some of these skills. Monitoring and evaluation is definitely a buzzword in the international development field, but you can see that it's important in other fields. So as an example, in my work as a learning advisor, we're constantly being asked to monitor the effectiveness of our programs. So when someone takes a course with me, they get an evaluation form and they evaluate both me as a facilitator and they also evaluate the program that we just offered them. They evaluate the learning setting. All kinds of evaluation goes on in learning. So for you, when you were working, you most likely were reporting back up to your program manager, whether that was in Canada or in country, and you would have been reporting things like the number of participants in workshops, the number of women who came into the location that you were at, the number of times you went somewhere, the increase that you would see in various programs. So you were monitoring, and you might not have been evaluating as much. That might have been somebody else's job, but you were certainly monitoring these things, and you were certainly feeding them back up. So monitoring and evaluation is a skill that you would have gained at CUSO, but you would also probably have gained it in your university program as well, because you're constantly monitoring your marks and you're constantly evaluating how well you're doing, right? So if you write a paper for one professor and you get a B and you're like, oh, that wasn't so good. I wasn't really happy with that mark. Then you evaluate what was going on and you change your writing style, especially if they've given you feedback. So we're constantly in this process of monitoring and evaluating, and it's how you frame it on a resume that's important. Um, so it doesn't matter that it's in an academic setting or if it's in the field, you are doing monitoring and evaluation, and you would have that skill set. The next skill set you have to get if you're working, especially if you're working as a volunteer with CUSO, is strategic thinking, right? Linear thinking does not work in international development. It would be awesome if it did, but it really doesn't. You need to be able to anticipate, you need to be able to interpret things, you need to be able to work with other people, and you need to see where, you need to see how your idea is going to link in with other ideas, and you need to be able to incorporate all of those things together when you're making your plans and priorities. So strategic thinking involves all kinds of things like, um, I know when I worked in Grenada, there's a rainy season. So you do certain activities, obviously, when the rainy season isn't on. So, if you're going to go and do site visits into more of the interior of the island, you wouldn't do that when there's or not the monsoons, but when there's the tropical storms, because that would not be a clever thing to do. So you need these strategic thinking skills, and you've developed them when you work in international development, because you really have no choice but to develop that skill, because no matter what plan you put in place, it will always need to be changed. And that ability to change is part of strategic thinking. So the next skill you'll no doubt have developed is problem solving. And most likely what you discovered is that the position that you were hired into, you might have had to sort of make that position work, or it might not have been the best fit, or it might not have been fully scoped out. And so you were probably having to do a lot of problem solving in order to be able to fit what you were able to do into the work that you'd been assigned to do. And problem solving takes on all kinds of different dynamics when you're living in a foreign country. So problem solving can be things like figuring out how to get your bank account set up, and figuring out how to get buses that don't necessarily run on any kind of predetermined schedule. So you're constantly in problem solving mode, especially when you're in country. And I would say that's probably one of the most tiring things about being a volunteer, is that you don't get to stop problem solving. And often people are bringing you problems that have absolutely nothing to do with your placement, but yet there's an expectation or a hope that you would be able to help them with these problems that they're experiencing. So problem solving is definitely a skill that you would have developed while you were working with CUSO. So teamwork. This is actually me in Grenada, and my team was awesome. Little me all by myself, but my program manager and my executive director, I had to sort of go all the way to the other side of that lagoon, and then across to the other side, went through a tunnel, get to the bus station, and then go all the way up, halfway up the country. And it was a long, long journey, but it also what I found was it was very, very social, my workplace. So when I would go into the office, um, I would get next to nothing done. Truly next to nothing. And so I finally said to my executive director, would it be all right if I worked from home a couple of days a week? And so we agreed that 2 days a week I would work from home. So this is me working from home, and I'm still connected to my team because I had internet access, but it worked really well for us that for some of my time I'd be at the school, and for some of the time I'd be at home. And the time I was at home, I was really productive, and the time I was at the school was much more about developing relationships, which hopefully is something that you were able to do while you were on placement, because really it is those relationships that create the trust that you're going to do the work that they need, and that you're going to be a help and a benefit to them. So teamwork skills would be something that you would have developed while you were in country, and most likely something that you've already developed either through your volunteer experiences elsewhere, through your educational experiences, or through any sports that you happen to participate in. Teamwork is always a factor. So time management is another skill you'll have learned. Oftentimes you're given a project and it has a timeline, and sometimes that timeline is realistic and sometimes it's not. I remember when I got my project, I was working with two different organizations, and my project was 10 months. And when I got there and started working, I was like, 10 months? Like, how could I possibly do this in 10 months? And then I found out that it was supposed to be 2 years, but because of the way the funding cycle was, they'd had to shorten it so that it would line up with the end of the funding cycle. So I was trying to do a 2 year project in 10 months. So time management is something that you definitely have to learn how to manage. And then if you happen to work in the Caribbean, you may have to learn about island time, and that things happen whenever they happen. And so if you're North American, you have a strong tendency towards punctuality, which again goes back to that cross-cultural communication. Not everybody has that sort of sense of things need to happen on time. Even when I worked in the school, my teachers that would be working at the school, they wouldn't even show up on time to class. So it's one of those things that you need to learn how to work with. Sometimes you need to work around, but time management will be something that you definitely were challenged with, that you would definitely have had to master or in some cases let go of. But all of that is really great to have on a resume in terms of being able to be flexible and adaptable and manage your time and manage your projects in a way that helps the organization that you were sent to work with, but also sort of honors your own internal sense of getting a job done. Planning and organizing, hopefully it wasn't so long ago that you can't remember how much work it was to plan and organize your departure. For me, I went with my husband and two children. So the planning and organizing just to get there, not even what you did while you were in country, but the planning and organizing, planning what to do with your apartment, planning what to do with your plants, with your pets. There was just a lot of planning and organizing that goes on. And then when you're in country, there's a lot of planning and organizing that goes on. And again, that cross-cultural communication and managing expectations. Um, Something I thought was really amusing when I was leaving the country, we had a big sort of to-do at the school, and the executive director stood up and she said, I just want to thank Sarah so much. She got so much accomplished. She got these seven curriculum um, for the vocational trades designed for us, and we really thought she wasn't going to do anything. And I was really taken aback, and I was just, I'm sure she could see the shocked look on my face, and she said, well, we had people come in and give us an estimate that it would cost $250,000 US, which in Grenadian terms would be so outrageously unaffordable. I mean, a semester at the school was 100 Eastern Caribbean dollars, which would be 50 US dollars. So imagine $250,000 when your tuition is 50 US dollars. So she said, we just didn't think you'd ever do anything. We just thought you were coming for a vacation. So, when I was planning and organizing my work, I was planning to complete, and they were planning for me not to do anything. So it was kind of amusing to hear her perspective of what she thought was going to happen and what actually did happen. So I exceeded expectations on that one. But planning and organizing is a daily, I would say, part of your experience as a volunteer. Probably you experienced that you needed to plan a lot more how to get your food. You had to plan your time if you lived in a country where seasons aren't as prevalent or predominant as they are in Canada. I know where I was, the sun would come up at 6 and it would go down at 6. And so you really had 12 hours to get stuff done. And once it got dark, you really didn't do very much. So all of that, adjusting to all of those things takes a lot of planning and organizing skills. The next area that you would have developed skills in is diversity and inclusion. Most likely the country that you were volunteering with would not have been, unless you were doing diaspora, but I don't believe many of you were. Um, you would have been working in a culture that was outside of your own. So you learned a lot about the value of diversity, what different cultures bring not only to Canada, but what they bring to the workplace, how different working styles can be incorporated, and how they have a positive impact on the workplace. And you're most likely a lot more open to other people than you were before you had this experience. So diversity and inclusion in Canadian society is very important for organizations, and organizations are often trying to recruit a diverse workforce. So if you're working in a company and you have these diversity and inclusion experiences that you can bring to the table, you might end up being a very good ambassador for them, or you might be able to help recommend ways to increase their diversity and inclusion by noticing things that are happening that might make it unpalatable for somebody to work for that organization. So I often talk to my students in my courses, and we obviously have a duty to accommodate people who have childcare issues. And I remind them that a childcare issue is only an issue for the first 4 years of a child's life. Then they go into school, and you no longer have these really, really challenging problems around finding a daycare, being able to drop your child off at a daycare that opens when you need it or stays open till when you need it. So we have to be flexible with our parents who are employees, because we know this is a short-term problem and we'll get over it. But oftentimes you see employers being unreasonable about start times. Everybody has to start at this time, even though the person can't get their child to daycare, and that person ends up leaving. And they could have been a really valuable employee if we had just had the foresight to spend a little bit more time and be patient and recognize that most problems are short-term problems. So diversity and inclusion, being able to see the challenges that, or the barriers that are facing people in employment, can be a really positive skill set that you bring to an organization. So the next one is respect for protocol. Most likely the country that you were going to or that you were working in had different types of work protocols, different types of rules around respect and what that looked like. I know in Grenada, certainly there was unwritten rules about how you would carry yourself. So your skirts had to be longer than your knees, which for all the women listening, I dare you to try and find, something that isn't a maxi dress that has a skirt longer than your knees. It's practically impossible in Canada. And you couldn't have your shoulders showing. So they would call that armless. You couldn't go armless, which I was okay. So no, had to have sleeves. So very, very formal workplace, which in Canada we're not used to. We would certainly wear sandals to work in the summer. Nobody would have a problem if a woman was wearing a dress that was shorter than her knee and didn't have sleeves. And the other thing that they were very firm on was that everybody was called by their last name. So Mrs. Rylott, Mrs. Douglas, Mr. Campbell. It was never first names. So even in my social, even when I would see my teachers in my school socially, it was still Mr. Campbell, Mrs. Douglas. Nobody ever said, just call me Anderson or just call me Lorna. It was always very, very formal. So you have to respect that, right? You have to learn that in this place, in this time, this is how respect looks. And it might not be the same in your culture, but in this culture, that's how it looks. And some of you might have found that there was protocols around reporting relationships or informal relationships that you had to respect as well. So while this person might be your boss, you really needed to clear it with somebody else over here on the side, because if you didn't do that, then it was really never going to get to your boss. So you learn all about these both formal and informal protocols. And protocol is really important, especially if you're going into an organization that's large or one that deals a lot with government. So that would be our next skill. That government relations will also be an area that you'll probably have had some experience with. Um, when you're working for a nonprofit, oftentimes there's ties into the local government. So maybe you would have been working directly with a ministry, or maybe the nonprofit that you were working for was funded by a government ministry. Perhaps you had challenges, like I did, around visas. So more than likely you encountered government officials within your placement, and you had to have relationships with that government, whether it was for work permits, whether it was related directly to your programming. I know Grenada is a really small country. There's only 70,000 people, so it's it's really common that you're going to have relationships with people who are within the government. So I ended up, when I was doing my research for um, one of the programs that I was working on, I had to go in and talk to sort of the head of one of the government ministries, so a minister within the government. And that's pretty common in a small country. I mean, if you're in a very large country, that wouldn't be the case. But you more than likely had some relations with government officials, and it's just a matter of thinking back about your time and thinking, what did I do that involved the government of that country, whether it was national, regional, or local government? And you'll probably figure out that you did actually have some experience with government relations. And of course, you would have experience with nonprofits. So most likely, when you did your placement, you did a placement with a nonprofit. So you would have gained experience about how nonprofits work. Maybe you experienced their board membership. Maybe you experienced fundraising issues. But more than likely, you have had some exposure to nonprofits. And especially if that's the area that you're going to be working in is with nonprofits, then having that on your resume and identifying that you've got a skill set around the nonprofit sector is going to be an important variable for you moving forward. So now that you've thought about, and we sort of gone over some of the more common skill sets that you would have gained from a international volunteering experience, you need to be able to articulate those skills in a way that makes sense. So I want to show you a really neat website. And the website verbs1.com, which I don't know why they chose that name, but anyways, that is the name of the website. What they do is they list verbs alphabetically. And I think this is fantastic because when I look at resumes as a professional, often I'll see responsible for, or oversaw, um, organized. Like people just use the same words over and over and over again. So I highlighted in blue some words that you might have used while you were working. So perhaps you abided by regulations, perhaps you abided by rules, you might have accelerated a process, you might have accelerated the timelines, you might have accommodated people's needs, you might have accepted responsibility, you might have accompanied your colleagues to meetings. You might have accomplished things. You might have accounted for different things. So this is just what I want to sort of draw your attention to is that this is a list of verbs from AB to AD. So as you can imagine, the list of verbs starting with A goes on and on and on and on and on. And then you'd have to move to B and C. So I find it really useful to often when I'm designing a resume, I'll go in and I'll do exactly this. I'll go and I'll look for a verb that starts with A, a verb that starts with C, a great verb that starts with F, a verb that starts with W, and that's how I start to build out the resume, because then I know I'm not using the same word twice, and it pushes me to be creative in my thinking, right? So if I just pick one of these words, adopted, okay, so what did I adopt? I adopted a professional manner relative to my placement. I adopted policies and procedures. Um, I adopted, or if I instead of adopted, I adapted. I adapted to, regulations. So it really pushes you to think about a time where you use that verb versus when you think about an example, you tend to have one or two really good examples of your work and then you frame it in a certain way. But when you use verbs to sort of jumpstart that process, you'll often find that you come up with really, really interesting narratives that go on your resume versus trying to think of the situation ahead. So, a great experiment to try is to just go into this website, pick a few verbs, and then see what you can come up with for your placement. Or tell yourself, I'm going to do 20 verbs and just randomly select them and then see what you can come up with. I guarantee you, you'll come up with much more interesting content than if you just sat down and started listing the skills or listing your job duties. So I really, really like this format for helping to define your value because it pushes you into that more creative space in your brain versus a listing, and listing is not a very creative activity. So now that we've thought through sort of the skill set that you're bringing and using some really good verbs in your resume, let's look at job advertisements and see how we would link up the skills that you used in CUSO with the actual labor market. So what I did was I pulled some jobs from Indeed, and the jobs I looked for were in international development just because I know that at least one of our participants is interested in that field. So it made sense to use something that was relevant to one of our participants. So here's a job for a program assistant with the Red Cross. And we can see when it was posted and the region that it's going to be working in. And then if we look at the actual skills that they were looking for, they want organizational skills, which we talked about, working with minimal supervision, self-starter, which is another word for initiative, analytical, another word for critical thinking, problem-solving skills, we looked at problem solving as well. So the skills that you gain from international development are very transferable over into working in Canada in that sector. So here's another one, Senior Director Advocacy and Government Engagement with World Vision. Monitoring and evaluation, analysis, social justice, cross-cultural, team player. So again, all of those skills that we were talking about earlier are present in these job advertisements. And the last one I found was with the Red Cross, a logistics officer, and it talks again, analysis, planning, creative thinking, effective communication, cross-cultural, tight deadlines. So there's your time management, obviously your cross-cultural and communications, planning, analysis, all the same skill sets. So what you want to do in order to help you clarify what is important to these organizations is what you can do is you can use something called a Wordle, and you've probably, when I show it, you're probably gonna be like, oh, that's what. So the next thing we want to do is make sure that we tie that into the labor. What you're going to find is that making that link and finding the one or two or three at the most industries where you can target your skill sets to will see your chances of being successful in your job search increase astronomically. So really spend the time to think about, what are your personal values so that they're not in conflict with the industry that you are planning to target. Look at the skills that you've gained and then make sure that you're making that connection back into the labor market by picking good choices for your target industries where you know that there's either a growing field or that there's the potential for employment. So this is one of my favorite authors to start with, and then one of my favorite quotes. So the only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be. This is a really exciting time for you because you can choose to become whatever it is that you want. And so all those transferable skills that we talked about at the start of this webinar can transfer into all kinds of different fields. So it's going to be all about you and all about what you want and which direction you want to take with your career, because at this point your career can go anywhere. So you could be a project manager in international development, or you could be a project manager in environmental sciences, or you could be a project manager in the government. There's so many options available to you. So take this time right now to reflect on what it is and where it is that you want to be. Because when you get clear about that, you start to see the opportunities. When you have this really broad scope and broad energy that's being targeted at a job search, you often find you're very unsuccessful. But the more targeted you are, the more focused you are, the clearer the vision you have of what it is that you want to become, the faster you will find that you make your way to that path. So I hope this has been really helpful for you. I hope that you can think about those competencies and be able to tie them into your resume. And the next webinar that we're going to be looking at is your creating a resume and some tips about creating a resume. And so hopefully that's going to, all of these are going to just marry together really, really well. And by the end of the webinar series, you're going to have a plan of who you want to be, a resume that's targeted to that, and a LinkedIn profile that supports that vision of yourself and that future that you're creating. All right, so if you've got any questions, you can always email me, and I'm always able to respond, usually within 24 hours. All right, have a great night. Thanks, everyone.